Hi, I'm Mark Wilson. I am a religion professor and religion department coordinator here at Southern Wesleyan University. And I wish I could be with you in person, but I'm traveling and unable to do so. So I apologize for doing this by video, but it's the only way that I was able to pull it off and still be able to share some things with you that might be helpful for you. It wasn't too long ago that I was in your shoes. I'm a late bloomer to academia. I'm a pastor, and then I went back to school after decades to get my doctorate. And just a couple of years ago, was able to complete that with my dissertation and stuff in my research. And I did a qualitative research design. But when I had the class on research methodology, I walked away confused, and I had all kinds of questions, and nobody kind of helped me figure out the pieces. How does this thing go? Now, it wasn't at SWU, because I'm sure their research methodology courses are much better than what I received. But I thought this might be helpful to walk with you, like how I did what I did, and the tools that I used to do it. All right. So I'll just kind of walk with you through my project and then show you like what I used and why I did it that way. And that way it'll help you maybe with your project. You can take these things and apply it to your own situation. So I'm going to share my screen with you now. My project was called Preaching for Congregational Vitality. Preaching for Congregational Vitality. And I have no idea why this toolbar is there. Oh, there we go. Well, I guess we'll just put it up there somewhere. Okay. So basically, you know, the churches are in decline and all that. And so the question is like, is there a decline in preaching? And is there any association with the downhill of the American church and the quality of preaching in the American church? But really, I want to go a different direction, because there are thriving churches in every community. And the question is, what's right with the preaching in those churches? And is there any association between the thriving of a church and the quality of the preaching in that church? And so that's what I was looking for. And I needed to do some kind of study to look for a correlation, if there is any, between the thriving of a congregation and the preaching in a church. And so I had a twofold research question. The first one was, what are common characteristics of preaching that are found in representative congregations of multiple denominations that exhibit growth and vitality in the South Carolina Upstate? And then how might preaching be a factor in congregational growth and vitality? So the first question is convoluted a little bit. It has a lot of different things, right? So representative congregations of multiple denominations. So it's not just one denomination, it's a whole bunch of different ones. So we want to get a cross section in the upstate of South Carolina. So I defined that. So what you'll want to do with your research question is to define things as much as you can. And that's what we did. And really what we're trying to figure out is the correlation. Is there any correlation between preaching and congregational growth and vitality? Is preaching a factor at all? Does it contribute to that? And if so, what are the common characteristics of churches that show growth and vitality? Now, I picked the upstate of South Carolina because that made it easier for me to define something, because there are lots of churches and lots of places. So this is what I did. Now, you need to define your terms. Always define your terms. There'll be a section in your dissertation where you define your terms. But for me, like, congregational vitality meant more than just like some sign of life, like grandma's in the intensive care unit, they're about ready to pull the plug. It isn't that. It's more like thriving. It's moving forward, that there's strong evidence that the church is alive and thriving and doing well. So that's what we wanted to do. And so for my study, I defined it this way, that these churches needed to be recognized as thriving by somebody who knows what they're talking about, like maybe a bishop or a superintendent or a religious thought leader, and that there's some measurable evidence of growth and outreach. Now, this is usually statistical, like is the church growing numerically in a worship attendance? Are there new members coming? Are there new professions of faith or new baptisms or anything like that? And is there evidence on their website, for instance, that they're reaching out to the community in some way or other? So I had to look for these different factors to make my selection of my 10 churches. And so I defined it this way. And when you do your selection, I guess you can do a random sampling, but if you want to do a representative sampling, then you need to define how you're going to do it. You don't want to game the system or skew your research by choosing people that you know will answer the questions the way you think they should answer them. So I said they need to be in the upstate of South Carolina. That limits it there. They have to show numerical growth under the current pastor's leadership. That eliminated 90% of the churches. There's some indication of outreach. This would be on the website or whatever. They're recommended by a denominational leader or a religious thought leader. Now that could be like a bishop, a superintendent, or it could be like the editor of the church page for the Greenville newspaper. And that there's a primary preaching pastor who preaches at least half the time, 26 times a year. Now, there are some thriving churches that did not meet that criteria. In fact, the two largest churches in the region did not. Grace Church and New Spring have team preachers, and so there's not one preacher that preaches for 26 times in a year. And so I left them out because I didn't want to have to do multiple preachers in the church to figure out what the preaching voice is of that church. That's another study. That's a study for another doctorate. So I picked my 10 preachers. I had a Baptist and a Presbyterian and a Wesleyan and an Episcopalian and an Independent. And I had I had a Pentecostal, a couple of Pentecostals, a couple of Methodists, a Southern Baptist. So I actually had more Baptists. I think 3 Baptists and 2 Methodists, which was really a picture of the ecclesial or church landscape in the upstate of South Carolina. Now, what I did with this is I wanted to look at these 3 factors: credibility, content, and connection. This comes from Aristotle, then by St. Augustine, who talked about good preaching. And he said there needs to be the character of the preacher or the credibility of the preacher. There needs to be good content of what the person's saying is worthwhile. And there's a good connection between the preacher and the audience. And so this is all I had at first. And I wanted to make observations on these areas, like credibility, content, and connection. And so, and I'm doing this in the spirit of appreciative inquiry. Appreciative inquiry comes from sociology, and basically it says, what's right here? What's right? So I wasn't looking to be critical of the preachers or what they're doing wrong or like what they should have done better. I'm not thinking like that at all. I'm just saying what's right with the preaching in these churches and just what are my general observations. And so that's what I did. It wasn't a critique in a negative way. If there's any critiquing at all, it was just appreciative. It's like, oh, that's interesting. Wow, that's fascinating. And so that's kind of the approach that I took, appreciative inquiry. So in the spirit of appreciative inquiry. And what I did was a comparative discourse document analysis. Now, it could be a discourse analysis if it's just sermons, but the sermons were recorded. They're recorded by video, and the recordings are documents. So this would be a discourse/document analysis. Anytime you're doing recorded speech, it's kind of both. It's a discourse document analysis. The document is the video, or it could be a manuscript as well. So it's a comparative discourse or document analysis, and I used constructivist grounded theory. There are at least 3 major schools of grounded theory, and then there are adaptations of all 3 of those. And so lots of different schools of grounded theory, and each one says they're the school of a grounded theory, they're the right one. But I used generally speaking, a constructivist grounded theory approach by Shamaz, I think was the one that's the champion of that. I modified it slightly. So it's Wilsonian constructivist grounded theory. And what I wanted to do was to extrapolate common preaching themes using constructivist grounded theory of my 10 thriving churches. These churches have nothing in common with each other except for the fact that they're thriving. And then what I did was I created a framework, a homiletic framework for congregational vitality. Homiletic means preaching, so a preaching framework for congregational vitality. So I created a theory, is what I did. And that's what it does. And now you want to go into this with a clean slate as much as you can, because and try to be unbiased, because as Menger says, if you torture data sufficiently, it will confess to almost anything. So what you want to do is try to come in with a clean slate and let the data speak for themselves. And so this is what grounded theory does, actually. Grounded theory is based on that very premise that you do not come in with a hypothesis that you're trying to prove, but what you're doing is you are discovering things and letting it emerge. Let the hypothesis emerge from the data exploration. And from that, you end up creating a theory. So grounded theory is not testing the hypothesis. It's actually letting the hypothesis come to life as you explore the data. This happens through iterative cycles of coding. You do lots and lots and lots of coding, but you do it more than once. You can't just look at it once and check it off and say that it's done. You do iterative coding cycles. You make memos of your observations, the questions you have, and the insights that you have. And you constantly are comparing things to see, like if the fifth time in you see something, oh, that's interesting. I think I saw this back in number 2 and 3 and 1, and you go back to 2, 3, and 1 once again. You do it back again. Say, yep, there it is, there it is, there it is, there it is, and then you got something, and you got something. Now, by the way, speaking of grounded theory, my advisor and also the person who taught the research methodology class brushed over grounded theory and said, don't do that. Whatever you do, do case studies, don't do grounded theory. But they say it's a lot of work. And it kind of is, but it's wonderful work. It's delightful work because you end up creating something that's fascinating. So I would say don't get chased off by people that try to scare you. Usually the people that are trying to scare you away from grounded theory don't understand grounded theory, and that's why they do that. So the way that I did it, and again, like I mentioned, there are different schools of thought about how this works, and some are much more insistent on differentiating these cycles than others. But basically, there are 3 coding cycles. That's what I used. With Shamaz, with grounded theory, or with constructivist theory, she says sometimes these can be conflated. But I used 3 coding cycles. There's an open coding cycle where you're just going in with a clean slate, making all kinds of observations. Then there's a selective coding cycle where you are actually coding it line by line by line, or whatever you're doing there to see if you can go into detail in observations. Incident by incident is what this is called. And then there's a theoretical coding cycle where you're actually merging codes together and things bubble up to the top and the theory emerges. I didn't quite have enough confidence to call mine a theory. I called mine a framework. I think it is a theory, but I just didn't have the guts to call it one. I called it a framework. So there's open coding and selective coding. So in the open coding cycle, I coded 34 sermons of these 10 preachers. And I started with an blank slate. I had a worksheet that had those 3 areas, the credibility, the content, and the connection, and said, okay, what's going on? And where does that fit in one of these 3 things? So I used an analytic worksheet to do that. And then I started putting stuff into my analytic worksheet as I made observations. And the more I observed the sermons, the more things emerged. And so I'm looking at everything here in the open coding cycle. Like, what do they wear? Do they yell or do they whisper? Do they manuscript it, or does it seem like they're just doing it off the cuff? How is their sermon organized? How long do they preach? Do they use a handheld microphone or a lapel or nothing? Are they using technology? Just all this stuff. How are they engaging with the audience? Are they using humor? What kind of illustrations do they use? How often do they refer back to the Bible? How do they use the Bible? Stuff like that. And so like just every imaginable thing is in the open coding cycle. And I'm just making all kinds of observations and I'm writing it all down. I'm just writing all kinds of stuff down. Who's the audience? So that's the open coding. And now I did 34, there are 10 preachers. And so it averages 3 per preacher, but some of them there are 4. And the reason for that is I'm looking for the preacher's voice. What is this preacher doing? And if I couldn't figure it out in 3, then I needed to go for a 4th one, or maybe even a 5th one, possibly, to get that preacher's voice. Like if the first one is like this and the second one's like this and the third's like this, you can't find the commonality yet, then you keep going until you find the commonality. Now, the sermons that I used were just randomly picked. I did not have any rhyme or reason. I just picked a day and used their sermons, and so I didn't have any specifics in that. Then the second line of coding is the selective coding. This would be, for me, it was a line by line sermon analysis, an actual line by line or meaning by meaning analysis of the actual sermons. And so if you're doing this, say, with interviewing people, your first cycle would just be making general observations in your interviews, and then you go line by line in your actual interview, or incident by incident, paragraph by paragraph, however it is, topic by topic, to say, what are they doing here, and what are they doing here, and what are they doing here, what are they saying here, and then you code it, and that's what I want to talk about. So I had this coding matrix template that I used. I completed that for each one. And then when I went to the second coding cycle, this is where I used Atlas TI. Now, Atlas TI is what I found to be the best qualitative research analysis tool that I could find. Now, there might be something better now, but I could not find it then. There are some free ones, but they're clunky. And there are very expensive ones that do kind of the same thing as this. But I don't want to pay $2,000 for something when I can pay $10 a month for it. And there's a student license. That's what I did. You have to actually prove you're a student, and you have to go through a process of approval for that. And you can either do the cloud license, which is $10 a month. That's what I did. Or you could do a $99 for 2 years or $51 for 6 months. If I was to do it over again, I would do the $99 for 2 years, because I want to research things now, and I can't because I'm not a student anymore. And so, like, what I could have gotten for $99 for 2 years, like $45 a year or whatever, now I have to pay hundreds and hundreds of dollars to be able to do that very same thing. So, so you're at a perfect time to be doing this. I would say sign up for the tool, the $99 one. That would be put it on your computer, and it's not web-based then. Mine, again, was web-based. Now, the nice thing about the web-based is I can go back and access it, and I think I still could access it on my computer, but I can also share it with you. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to share it with you right now. And there's my Atlas, right? Let's see. Let's see if we can find it. Okay, here it is. Preaching for Congregational Vitality. They'll give you a demo so you can play around with it and stuff like that. But what you do is you will end up inputting your stuff, inputting the sermons. And I'll show you like how I did that later on. But so there's my different sermons. There's my different preachers. And it talks about how many codes I found and how many quotations I found in each of these, right? So we'll do, okay, here's Tompkins, my Methodist preacher. And if I click, let's see, on his codes here, what do we got? Okay. Okay, so like I'm doing incident by incident. It isn't exactly line by line. It's like there's like 3 or 4 lines there. And there's sometimes where he's doing like 2 or 3 different things in the same line. So there I would code it that way. So there's faith, inspiration, you can see there's Christ. Oh, he's making a quote now. And now now he's entering the text. This is where he's going into the Bible. Oh, and now he's digging out the Bible, explaining what it means, and now he's connecting to the people, and now he's being poetic. You go, so that you just kind of you add it, and you can put your own colors in. It will give you the, like options that you can do whatever colors you want to tag it. So basically, what you end up doing is you kind of go like that, you highlight it, and then you can create a quote of that way, or you can create a tag, and then okay, so you do the tags, and then you can end up merging tags together, the codes together, and this is how you create your theory. You can take some, and so like for instance, I had one called Enters the Text. I had another called Illustration Bible. I had another one called Biblical Exegesis. And I combined all those. Here's what biblical reference. These are all different individual codes that different preachers had that I just randomly put on the side. And then later on, I combined all of those into one big code called Enter the Text. And I had another called Define the Problem. I had another one called Name the Pain. These are the big ones that emerged. So if I go back to Code Manager for a minute, let me see if I can filter this. Oh yeah, okay, yeah, we're good. I got it right here. So I actually at the end of the thing, it actually tabulates the whole thing for you. You don't have to do it yourself. It does it for you. That's the nice thing about this kind of software. And what it shows here is that the #1 code of all of my preachers, line by line, which basically what I did was 2 sermons that I'd previously done at least 3 for these guys in the open coding process. And then I did at least 2 in the incident by incident, line by line coding to take it to the next level, right? And so in this thing where I'm doing 2, now there are some of them, if they preach shorter sermons, I did 3 for them in order to have an equal level as far as the coding. Like it isn't fair for the long-winded Pentecostal preacher who preaches 69 minutes to get all the codes, because he's preaching more, he's going to have more codes. And so like then I would add more sermons for the shorter preachers, the short-winded preachers, to make sure that there's an equal distribution of coding. So in that whole thing, what I found was this, that my top code came out with 173 lines or incidences that came up as prophetic challenge. These are kind of merged together as these where he would be saying things that would say, guys, you got to do this, and this is really important, and you better listen up, or like speaking a word of truth to them. That was #1, which was really interesting. Goes against the grain that people say you have to water it down and make it wishy-washy to grow a church, because that's not true. Entering the text was 2nd, faith inspiration was 3rd, naming the pain was 4th. Now, this was very interesting to me because I noticed naming pain in the open coding cycle originally. That was my biggest and first discovery. It was like, oh my goodness, all of these preachers, they're very different from each other, but they all name pain. They put words to their parishioners' pain. And so they're actually putting words to that. They're speaking it. They're entering into the pain of their listener. And so whether they're an Episcopalian, a Presbyterian, or a Baptist, they're very different from each other. One might yell it, and the other will say it poetically, reading it from a script, but they're speaking words that say, I understand your pain. This is big. This is really a big deal. And then I also noticed that the preachers, the #1 illustration that they used was the Bible itself, like the stories from the Bible itself. It wasn't just from their life. I thought it would be from their life. And I thought storytelling would show up here because I'm a storyteller, but it didn't. Storytelling came way down the line. So this all comes from the line by line coding, and you can do reports of the coding. Let's see, does this do me reports? Let's see. There's a quotation manager. There's a memo. Oh, the memos. With the memos, like if you have a question, I found. Oh, look at that. It's interesting. They're using the Bible as illustration. We should take a look at this Bible as illustration thing. Oh, they do humor through phrasings, just funny phrasings. Naming the pain. There are a couple of guys that don't name the pain, they name struggle. Is the struggle, naming the struggle and naming the pain the same thing? And yeah, the two that did that were more like football coachy kind of guys, and they weren't really tuned in. Let me tell you how you feel. But they talked about the struggle. The angst is still pain. It's just a different way of saying it, right? So I just all these memos that I did. And let's see. Okay, I think this one can show you. I thought I had one here where I could show you my well, yeah, that'll do it. That'll do it. It's a report, right? So this is a report of sermon illustrations. So this is what you can do then. You can pick whatever you want and you can have them tabulate it for you. So what I did was I did all of the sermon illustrations of all of the preachers in the line by line, and I looked at what kind of illustrations did they use. And when I did this, what I found out that Bible was by far the most common. The second most common was their personal life. This was their personal life. And it looks like using the listener's experience, talking about stuff that the listeners might be going through, or culture itself, stuff that's happening in the culture, was also an illustration. So you can do that. You can actually do reports of this stuff, and actually you can color code reports and all that, and that creates something really nice that you can actually put in your dissertation. So there's that. That's Atlas TI. Now, the way I got the line by line for the line, the words for the line by line coding when it was an auditory thing, these sermons were video. How did I do that? I used Otter AI. Now, it cost me $8.33 a month to do Otter AI. But what you do with Otter, once you sign up with that, is you can, you got a tutorial here. Where's my column? Oh, there we are, my conversations. So like we have these different preachers that I did. Now, you don't have to get it exactly word for word. This is not going to go in your dissertation. Now it could, if you want to use a quote from your dissertation, you can do that. But so I didn't really worry about correcting everything because Otter doesn't get everything right. It's artificial intelligence. It takes voice and puts it to text. And so basically what I did was I just took all of the text from Otter AI. Now, if there's something that was totally wacky, I changed that. But then what I did was then I inputted the stuff from Otter into Atlas. And then I coded at Atlas. I didn't code it through Otter. You can code through Otter, but it just doesn't give you as many capabilities as it does with Atlas. So I would suggest, now, one really cool thing here, if you're doing interviews and you're doing them by Zoom, it actually interfaces with Zoom. So you can do voice to text with Zoom, then collect it from Zoom, put it into Atlas, and then code it incident by incident or line by line. So Otter is 2 thumbs up for that. It really helped me. It saved a lot of transcription. I looked at transcriptions, like how to pay for this kind of stuff. And then I found Otter. I thought, man, $8. So basically I just waited until I collected all of it. And then I did like 2 months worth of Otter. And then I quit Otter. And so that worked out great for me. I also wanted to hear what the listeners were saying. So I did a questionnaire. Now we sent out several to each of the churches. We had, I think it was 20, at least 25 that we sent to each church. Now we didn't get all of the responses back from any of the churches. That's the way it is with questionnaires. But we had to have at least 10. We felt that 10 would be a good representative sampling. That's a minimum of that. So there was one of them, I think they got 10, but yeah, some of them had 20, some had 18, and they're open-ended questions. So I had 7 open-ended questions. Now, the reason why I'm doing open-ended questions is I don't want to skew the data by my questions. I don't want my data, I don't want the way I'm framing the question to skew the way they're answering it, so I get the results back that I want. So I asked these open-ended questions that they could answer however they wanted, and then I coded their answers. And I used SurveyMonkey for that. And there's different versions. There's a free version of SurveyMonkey that you can use, but you can't do the coding process with that. For me, it was $16 a month to do that. And I paid for a few months of that to do SurveyMonkey with the parishioners. And so basically, when you're doing that with the SurveyMonkey, for me, that I found that kind of clunky. Now, maybe if you're just doing like a 2 or 3 for a case study or something, this would be a lot easier. If you're doing several interviews, but you're using the same one, I think that you will find it easier if you're doing it that way. I had 10 different preachers, and I wanted to find out what each of their parishioners said about their sermon. So I had to have 10 different surveys, and then I had to analyze and code those. So each survey can tabulate the codes. You can tabulate that. But okay, this is one that had 10. And so you can basically you can collect the response. You send a little link to them. Now, the thing about that is, like, how do you find the survey people? Well, every one of these things, you got to think through it. Like, you can't just let the preacher pick whoever he wants. He's going to pick all of his buddies. So basically, we asked them to appoint somebody who's like a key person at the church that would be the collector. Usually it was like the church secretary or somebody like that. And then they randomly picked people that would be like a cross representation of the congregation. So we gave them specific instructions about how to do that. So like the first question, like, how long you been there? What were your top 3 factors that motivated you to choose this church? And so each of the respondents said their stuff. Again, I have 100 and some respondents that come back, and we looked at all of it. But so they answered open-ended things. And then what I did was I took what they said and tried to code it into something, right? So there's programs, relationships, and volunteer opportunities, right? Because they said the pastor contacted me and my family, that's relationship. The kids enjoy the kids ministry, that's a program. We're already plugged in. We're doing church work. Well, that's a ministry opportunity, a volunteer opportunity. The next person said the pastor's leadership and the vision of the church. Now I put, and move of the Spirit is what they said, move of the Spirit. So I put pastor, leadership, anointing, move of the Spirit. So I just went this to every one of those, every line that they said, I tried to code it to a broad code that you could put several things under. So they might say it in different ways, but they'd put it under that broad code. So I did this for all 10 churches, and that gave me some very interesting observations of the people. And then what I did was I interviewed the pastors, and because by the time I actually interviewing the 10 pastors, I had already done my research. I'd already made my observations of their sermons. I said, I've noticed this. Can you tell me more about that? And I gleaned from stuff that you could not observe. Like I asked them, for instance, how long do you study? Or how long does it take you to prepare a sermon? And who influenced you in your preaching? And I asked them also to tell me, like, how important is preaching to you as a preacher? So I asked the parishioners that question: how important is preaching in the growth and vitality of their church? But I also asked that to the preachers. Now, by the way, here, these are just some of the observations I made. I'm just going to real quick whip through that. There were, like, the average sermon was 37 minutes. 37 minutes, for heaven's sakes. That's because the Baptists and the Pentecostal really skewed it heavy. The two Southern Baptists were like 40 some minutes, and the independent Pentecostal was 69 minutes. he said it was not a 30-minute. He said it is not 69 minutes. I don't preach for 69 minutes. When I interviewed him, he said I preach for 30 minutes. He said, well, I actually have you recorded for 69. He says, no. It was 30 minutes of preaching and 39 minutes of altar call, is what he said. That's what that was. So I looked at what versions of the Bible they used. Like 8 out of 10 used technology. Was the primary thing with, like, they're kind of mixed about whether it's inform, inspire, motivate. Only 2 out of 10, though, said it's just about information. It's about moving people. It's inspiring people. Now, even though these are outreach churches, they're all thriving. They're all growing. Not one sermon was just about evangelistic, like Billy Graham, come give your life to Jesus kind of stuff. And only 1 out of the 34 sermons coded was targeted to, like, leading the church. And I've read dissertations and stuff that said that that's how you do it for evangelistic preaching, or whatever, a thriving church. You actually use the pulpit, leverage the pulpit for leadership. Now, some of them did talk about leadership, but only 1 sermon in that was really, what you would say, was geared that direction. Some where the audience seemed to be Christians, some mixed. None of them assumed that their audience was a bunch of pagans, but all of them assumed that people were struggling in their audience. The sermon types were all over the map. They're all different kinds of sermon types. There's the illustrations I was telling you about. This comes directly from the Atlas TI, right? And there's the line-by-line sermon codes, right, that I use. Name the pain, that shows up there. Prophetic challenge, faith inspiration, entering the text. They use humor. All of them use humor. They engage the audience, so they're saying funny things, or they're are you with me now? Stuff like that. One thing that's kind of interesting is that what I call names people. Like they all of the preachers actually, at the beginning of their sermons, they either named people or groups of people, thanking people. Let's pray for Bertha, or thank you to the youth group for the car wash the other day. And what they're doing is making an engagement kind of thing. They're just building relationship. Defining a problem. This came in as something significant that all of the preachers did. And I found that very interesting, and it made it into my homiletic framework. So there we go. I categorized my parishioner questions and all that. Here's what they found with the parishioners, that these are the why they stayed. They said relationships was first. Now, this is all the parishioners of all of the different ones. So the music was the third thing, and the preaching was the second thing. Now, if a relationship with the preacher is a part of that, then these could be conflated. I'm sure that this could even go up a little bit higher. Why does your church thrive? Why is your church growing? Why do you think it is? And preaching came out as number 1 there. What happens to you when your preacher preaches? And so they did different words, but these were the codes that I used in SurveyMonkey. So they moved and challenged, enlightened, engaged, inspired. Nobody said bored. And what do you appreciate about your preacher's sermons? They're biblical, they're candid, they're relevant. You notice there's this challenge thing, right? A Bible and a challenge that comes across the board in all of the different denominations. It doesn't matter what denomination. What is the influence of the preaching on your life? And challenge comes out of, again. You would think encouragement would come out a lot higher, acceptance and encouragement. They're there, but challenge is the big one. I asked them, how does your pastor's preaching, how has it impacted your congregation's vitality? And what was really interesting to me is that the majority of the people did not talk about the pastor's preaching. They talked about the pastor. They talked about the character of the pastor, the goodness of the pastor, the quality of the pastor. So it's the pastor's integrity. This is the credibility piece I was talking about at the very beginning, right? The ethos, the integrity, the credibility. So my pastor is believable because my pastor lives the life. That's kind of what they were saying. So when I did the interviews, I found that my observations pretty much straight across the board were confirmed. They said, yep, that's right. Took them 12 hours to prepare, so they didn't prepare any longer than anybody else. That was interesting. I thought maybe they'd be preparing longer, spending more time in sermon preparation, but they don't. I asked them who influenced them, and they talked about mentors, people that they knew, or models, people that they inspired them, people they never met, but they'd like watched on TV or read their books. Not one of them mentioned their preaching professor, which was very discouraging to me because I'm a preaching professor. 100% of them said that preaching is the most important thing they do in an average week. 2 of the 10 said preaching and something. They were tied. One said preaching and leadership. The other said preaching and caregiving or congregational care. But all of them said preaching. So then we come to my question. Is there a relationship between congregational growth and vitality and preaching? And what are the common characteristics? And the answer to that question is absolutely. Preaching is a significant factor for congregational vitality. The congregation said it in their surveys. The preachers, they all said it 100%. And then for triangulation, which is you want to have like bolstered 3 ways. It isn't just one way, but 3 ways. I'm sure that they probably told you about triangulation. I found a group called the Natural Church Development Survey, the largest church health survey in the world. And they actually have done surveys of the church health in congregations in South Carolina. So I reached out to them and asked if they could maybe do a special project for me. I paid the guy a couple $100, and he did the analysis of 321 South Carolina congregations. And he found that there's a direct correlation between the thriving of the church and the satisfaction with the preaching of the church and the meaningfulness of the preaching in the church. So this one did the same thing. So I would say that, yes, there's definitely a correlation. And then what I did with what kind of preaching happens in this, I created a framework or a theory, all right? And so there's like 7 things that I created. There's homiletic authority is the first one, that these preachers spoke authoritatively and they spoke authentically. And it had to do with stuff like their tenure, had to do with their love for the people, had to do with the fact that they relied on scripture. So a rookie preacher could still rely on scripture, still have homiletic authority, and it had to do with them being transparent about their own lives. Pastoral understanding was the second, that they named the pain. I thought about calling my dissertation Name the Pain, but there's actually another one that came out even bigger than that. But all 10 of my preachers named the struggle or the pain that the people were going through. They could relate, they could understand what the listener is going through. And so I asked them, how did you name the pain? How do you do that? And basically they talked about their own personal pain. They also said that like the Bible takes us to pain because the Bible talks about the human condition. And then some said, I live my life with my people, and that's how I know the pain of my listeners. There's this one guy that said, he said he had a young high school student who had an inoperable brain tumor, and the young student was going to die. It's at stage 4. And that student came and sat in the front row at church with his family every Sunday. And he said, That was my BS filter. I had to look at that family in the eyes and say, is what I'm saying, does it really resonate? Does it make sense to them? This is that. This is understanding the pain. Defining the problem, I found that all of my preachers did this, that underneath the pain, there's something else. Now, in a church, we call that the theological lens. There's an interpretation, a theological interpretation of the pain, or the saying that, oh, you're feeling this. This is the problem. You think it's this, but it's really this. And so they define the problem under the pain, and then they go to the text to come up to the solution of the problem. Sometimes they enter the text for the problem. They definitely enter into it for the solution. Scripture is seen as the authority, and they show this. Now, I say enter the text. They didn't just explain the Bible text, but they actually entered into it. So, like, sometimes they'd actually imagine, the listener could imagine themselves in the feeding of the 5,000, or they're one of the hungry people, or maybe they're the little boy that comes and gives us 5 loaves and 2 fish, and Jesus breaks the loaves and the fish and feeds the multitude. They actually enter the text, and they do deep dive stuff there. It's obvious that they've done their homework. Passionate proclamation is the next one. Not one of them was a dud as far as passionately delivered. They preached in imperatives. Now, there are some that write on preaching that say we should preach when in question marks mostly. It should be inquisitives, inquisitive preaching. But these 10 preachers were imperative preachers. Now, some were a little more quiet in their passion. It's kind of a quiet passion, but it's still passion. I mean, they're all in. They basically, what it says is they really believe this. They really believe this is true, and they're going to put an exclamation point on it. This is the biggest find. It was the first and the third code that I found in the line-by-line sermon coding. Prophetic challenge was number 1. Faith inspiration was number 3. Prophetic challenge, what I mean by that is you guys need to do this, and you need to straighten up, and this is wrong, and this has got to be fixed. Do you really think they would just tell it like it is, tell the truth, the unvarnished truth, the hard truth, they would say. But then there's always faith inspiration. I call this jalapenos and honey. Serve jalapenos and honey. So there's some challenge, and then there's comfort, right? So now some preachers were more jalapeno type, and some were more honey type. But all of them in all of their sermons had both jalapenos and honey. There was not one sermon that was just honey. That's just like cotton candy. It's bland. And there not one of them was like jalapenos. It's like skinning people alive. That doesn't work at all. But it's both challenge and inspiration, jalapenos and honey. And then finally, all of the sermons but one concluded with a beginning, an invitational benediction is what I would say. A benediction is a word of blessing. And basically it was one of these 3 things. It was either get help from Jesus, get right with Jesus, or go serve Jesus. One of those 3 things it had to be. Only one of them just kind of crash landed, and he just was running out of time, I think is what happened there. And he realized that, well, that's all, folks. But other than that, it was one of these 3. And that really helped me. So what I did was I created then a homiletic tool, a tool that I could use for my preaching students, and that preachers could use in their self-assessment to say, am I doing that? Are there any jalapenos in this sermon? Is it all honey? Or is it all jalapenos and no honey? And how am I landed the thing? Am I entering the text? Am I bringing the listener into the text with me? Am I naming the pain of the listener? Am I being passionate in the way that I'm doing that? And that helps the preacher be able to figure all of that out. So there you have it. That's my framework that I created, the theory that I created, and I did all of that through a grounded theory analysis. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I've talked to some people that have been trying to do that, particularly if you're looking at grounded theory. It might be helpful to talk to somebody who's been through that process. And hopefully this has been helpful for you. in conducting your own research and finding the methods that will work to give you the information you need. Thanks so much. God bless.